Atari was a major innovator through the 1970s and 1980s and produced pinball machines, arcade games, as well as home computers, and then they released one of the first Pong home consoles and later the Atari 2600, which was one of the first home video game consoles that had changeable cartridges, which was revolutionary at the time. And while the graphics weren't the best, it was a solid home console bringing home-based gaming to the consumer. Atari was starting to face heavy competition from other game consoles such as the Intellivision, ColecoVision, and the Vectrex, which were all far more powerful machines, so Atari decided to launch the Atari 5200, and while it was a strong console, but most of its games were just updated ports of Atari 2600 games, and despite Atari's board being warned about the controllers being faulty, they launched the console figuring even with bad controller quality build, that consumer loyalty will sell the console and its games. And with so much problems in the fact that the console was not backwards compatible with the Atari 2600 games without a huge adapter that was almost the size of the Atari 2600, the Atari 5200 failed, selling only 1 million units. Atari had not been giving game developers the credit they were due or giving them the pay grade they deserved, so many jumped ship and started making their own third-party Atari 2600 games, and a lot of these were not great. Also, Atari released 2 high-profile titles, Pac-Man and E.T., but both were crappy games. And Atari lost massive amounts of cash, and Atari failing to create a quality of seal system to tell consumers what games were good and what games were bad, and angering the video game market, and with massive amounts of bad games and several consoles on the market, caused a video game crash of 1983, which Atari was at least partially responsible for. Atari designed the Atari 7800, which was a powerful console, and it was backwards compatible with the Atari 2600 games. It was originally released in the summer of 1984, but Atari was sold to a new owner and the console was shelved, but would finally get a full release in January 1986. But it was too late, because the Famicom or Nintendo was dominating the market and many third-party publishers were not willing to make games for the 7800 or were not able to, and they were also facing competition from the Sega Master System, and Atari did not put the financial support into the console that they should have. But despite this, the console did sell 3.77 million consoles and did make Atari a profit. However, the console did not allow Atari to regain its dominance in the video game market. In 1989, Atari released the world's first 16-bit color handheld, the Atari Lynx, and while it was a powerful console, Atari messed up by making it big instead of compact, and it faced heavy competition from the Nintendo Game Boy, Sega Game Gear, and NEC's Turbo Express. The Lynx 1 had about 4 hours of battery life, while the Lynx 2 could do about 5 hours, and it was less expensive, but up against so much competition, and Atari failing to create a steady flow of games, the console never saw great success. A company called Flare, who were desperately trying to create a multi-chip architecture game console but couldn't secure funding, convinced Atari, who was desperate to get back in the video game race, to invest in their concept, and they started working on 2 consoles, a 32-bit system called the Panther and a 64-bit system called the Jaguar. Progress on the Jaguar was considerably faster than expected, so Atari abandoned the Atari Panther to work on the Atari Jaguar, but this was a serious mistake. The Atari Panther, from what I've read, was not a very powerful 32-bit console, but it would have been stronger than anything else on the market, and it was supposed to be released in 1991, long before the 3DO, Sega Saturn, Sony PlayStation, and the Nintendo 64. So the Panther was definitely worth launching because it would have showed Atari if video game developers were ready for multi-chip architecture game consoles, but also give them 2 to 3 years of no real challenge from stronger machines, and Atari could have made a serious comeback, and they would have been able to make necessary changes to the Atari Jaguar with more development time. Atari announces the Atari Jaguar in 1993 as the world's first 64-bit game console at a launch price of $250, and did a test market launch only in New York City and San Francisco and a full North American release in early 1994, but this was a disastrous mistake. Atari had managed to convince third-party developers to work on the Atari Jaguar, but Atari sent out very bad game development kits. There might as well have been a single piece of paper full of ones and zeros. Third-party developers had a nightmarishly very hard time trying to develop games for the Jaguar, and many developers bailed on the console. To make matters worse, the launch titles for the Jaguar were not even finished. Cybermorph was a pack-in game, which was in a three-dimensional plane, and to a degree it was a decent title, but it did not show off what the Atari Jaguar could do. But in all fairness, the 16-bit game Star Fox, which this one is compared to, was not out yet. Though the company that made the game is claiming they made a far better version of the game, which apparently was better than the Battlemorph sequel, but Atari made them scale down the game. And if that's true, that would make Atari guilty of cheapening out on a launch title, but I'll discuss that more when I review the game. Trevor McFear in the Crescent Galaxy, while it looks pretty good, graphically, it was obvious that it was not finished, from the basic design of some enemies and lack of in-game music. The Jaguar was initially selling far better than the Panasonic 3DO, but eventually sales started to drop because too many titles were coming out that were just poorly enhanced versions of 16-bit games. However, on October 20th, 1994, a must-have title came out that finally started to show off the Atari Jaguar's potential. Alien vs. Predator, which became a major console-selling game. The Jaguar did see more solid titles, but most were not showing up in time, and too many bad titles were showing up. Atari, as well as other third-party companies, did release several accessories including a multi-tap, a JagLink cable to link more than one Jaguar together, and with games like Doom could play deathmatch gameplay, a 6-button Pro controller which every Jaguar owner wants to have and is considered superior to the original controller, as well as a long-promised Atari Jaguar CD which allowed the Jaguar to play music CDs and now have CD-based games. However, the unit was rushed in production, so the failure rate on them is high, but I'll discuss that more when I review the add-on. Atari also released a memory cartridge for the Jaguar CD games. Atari announced a virtual reality headset that is compatible with Missile Command 3D, but sadly was not finished in time, but a few working prototypes still exist, as well as a modem that would have allowed players to talk to each other over games. Ultra Vortex is the only title compatible with the modem, but it was never released, though 100 prototypes were apparently made. A prototype web TV adapter was developed that would have allowed the Atari Jaguar to have a scaled-down internet browser. A Catbox adapter was released that allows the Atari Jaguar to display higher resolution visuals on high resolution display screens. The advertising campaign said, "Do the math," and while it could have been a catchy advertisement, it honestly looked more like a horrible joke.
Jaguar! Jaguar! Jaguar!
And clearly Atari had no idea what they were doing in terms of advertising the console to the masses. However, at least with titles like Alien vs. Predator, got solid advertisements which allowed the game to be noticed and sell well due to it being an excellent title.
Introducing Alien vs. Predator for the 64-bit Atari Jaguar. You might not want to play it alone.
Ah!
Mom.
But with such a bad advertising campaign, it's no wonder most video gamers ignored the Atari Jaguar. Between the console being difficult to program for and failing to give third-party developers solid development kits and launching with less than stellar launch titles, as well as a horrible advertisement campaign, and too many titles looking like 16-bit games that were not finished, it's no wonder the Atari Jaguar failed. Atari's leadership made many mistakes, and Atari's own internal hardware and software divisions were apparently not communicating with each other, so a lot of internal Atari games for the Jaguar were extremely delayed and management did shit to fix these problems. Also, I almost forgot, Atari never found a way to bring the console to other parts of the world because while the Jaguar had not done well in the United States and in Europe, reportedly places like Australia actually wanted the console, but Atari apparently was not in a position to send the console where it could actually sell. Tune in next time as I discuss what Atari could have done differently to save the Atari Jaguar and make it a major success. This is the Entertainment Wizard, signing off.